welcome back to my channel. I am Monique from Special Occasions by Design, and today we're going to do things a little bit differently. We are going to talk about contracts. So you decided that you want to be a part of the event decor, design, event planning, but you haven't quite thought everything through, or maybe you have, but there's some things that I just want to go ahead and discuss with you. That way, you don't make some simple, avoidable mistakes. Now, as a disclaimer, I will say I am a licensed attorney, licensed in Washington, D.C. So everything heard in this video or in the seen or read in the description box below should not substitute legal advice. Additionally, everything that I say or that's linked or typed in the description box below should not be considered as me giving you legal advice. We're just having a discussion based on my experience, which just happens to be legal, and also from just experience with me being in the event planning industry. Okay, so I'm going to be looking up quite a bit because I have a long list of things that I do want to go over in this video. So just be mindful when you see my eyes kind of dart away from the focus of the camera. That is why. It's not because I just need a break and have to look away. I just have to make sure I stay on target with the things that I really want to cover in this video. So, number one thing. What is a contract? So a contract is a legally binding agreement that's made between two or more parties in which a promise is made, and that promise is made with consideration in mind. Now that's a little bit dense, and I'm gonna go ahead and unpack it throughout the rest of this video. So one thing you need to keep in mind is contracts, whether they are verbal or written, are generally binding. So there are some things that we need to make sure your contract has to give you the best footing to present your argument that this is what was meant in your contract. Now, one thing I will say is the way my business is set up, the contracts that I offer are unilateral contracts. Now, a unilateral contracts are contracts in which a promise is made to do something and payment for this performance is made ahead of time. Now, if you are in the business where payment and performance are both placed at the end of your contract, then your contract is bilateral. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. The number one mistake that event planners or decorators or someone in the service-based industry that I listed before make is not having a contract. Now, we already stated that contracts, whether verbal or written, are legally binding. And a lot of people go into this agreement just with a verbal contract. Now, we all know verbal contracts is literally going to come down to he said, she said. So to eliminate that, always have a written, signed contract. Number two. So now you have a contract and you've already began performance. You're buying items, visiting the venue, talking with the client day in, day out, week after week. But you have not considered the things that either you can do or your client can do that can breach the contract. And that's one thing that you should always consider. What is a breach? Now, just keep in mind that a breach can be several things. You can have an actual breach, anticipatory breach, a minor breach, or a material breach. Now, depending on what kind of breach it is, that that will also depend on what happens to your contract. Does your contract still stand? Is it substituted? And we'll go a little bit into that. Now, when you talk or think about a breach, the first thing that comes into mind for me, and this happens very often, is in my contract, I have a very strict payment schedule. But for some reason, maybe my client gets paid on Fridays, and they told me this, but when I am setting up my contract, I put all payments for Wednesdays. Now, I already know it is possible I can anticipate a breach because it's more than likely that my client will say, hey, I can't pay you on Wednesday. Can I just pay you on Fridays from now on? If your contract spells out that the payment schedule is for payment to be made on Wednesdays, then this is a breach. And from my example, it is anticipatory because I knew it's possible that my client would not be able to make payments on Wednesdays because she already told me, hey, I get paid on Fridays and I'd prefer to pay you Friday or Saturday. This breach is also minor because it doesn't really destroy the contract in that you're still going to get paid for services. It's just a little delayed. All right, so we've talked about not having a contract and not considering what is a breach. So number 3 is failing to provide a clear route for termination. Now, many things can happen inside of a contract or in the span where performance is not fully rendered, where either you get a better opportunity that you just have to take, or your client just decides, I don't want to go through with this contract anymore, I'm not getting married anymore, or I'd rather go with a family member or somebody else. But you didn't consider how can we terminate the contract, how much of payment is still due, because of course some performance possibly occurred, how much is not due. And this is one big thing that happens all the time. People will get these clients that say, hey, I just decided that I just don't want to go with you. And what happens? You are in a place where you already received payment from this person. You don't know how much to refund. So having this route to termination in your contract will help you out with figuring out how much refund is due. So from experience, what I do to fulfill this in my contract, I will say a deposit is due, let you know how much of that deposit is refundable or non-refundable. Payment should be made on a schedule, and my payment schedule is usually 3 to 6 payments depending on how far out the event is or the need of the client. Then I will say this portion of the payment is deemed earned when these milestones happen. 1, I have visited the venue, presented you with the plan of action, and made actual purchases. So that will render your first payment as earned. Second, I generally will say if I have created all your centerpieces, in most of my parties, I do things custom. So I'll make the centerpieces by hand or send out for some portions of it to be made. So once that is done and that substantial performance has happened, milestone 2, that next portion of payment is earned. Payment 3 is generally earned after I have completed and assembled and emailed my client saying, this is the plan for setup, these are the items that I have completed to date, and the only thing remaining for this contract to be complete is for me to show up the day of your event and actually set up. So that brings me to milestone 4, which is generally the last portion of payment. And I like to give myself a price. So if I know that for me to set up, I would like to be paid $25 an hour, I'm just going to say 25, and it's going to take me, along with 3 other assistants, 2 hours to set up, and the portion of payment that is remaining is $200. And that $200 I know can cover paying my time for setting up, paying the assistant's time for setting up. Then if cancellation or termination of, not cancellation, I'm sorry, if termination of the contract happens after milestone 3, but prior to milestone 4, and a refund is due, I can refund this person $200. So it's very good to know what triggers termination, or better yet, what are the clear steps that each party must make to effectively terminate a contract, and how much of a refund, if any, is due. The next common mistake, and I believe this is number 4, is not clearly outlining a method or a mode for dispute resolution. Now, we are a suing country, so we know the first thing that generally pops into people's mind is, you didn't do what you say you're gonna do, and I am gonna sue you. Now, bringing a lawsuit is very expensive. You need an attorney to get very good representation. You can always do it yourself, but you generally want to go with an attorney to make sure you're adequately represented. I mean, you spent a long time building up your business. If it comes down to needing assistance for dispute resolution, hire an attorney. But some of that can easily be avoided. There are some less formal methods that you can actually put in your contract, and those will be binding once it's signed by your client. One of the least expensive ways is mediation. Now, mediation discussion or conference is not a binding route, but generally a lot of these disputes can get resolved that way. Because if it came down to, hey, you don't know how much to refund, and this person thinks instead of $200, you owe me $400. You didn't clearly break out how much performance is needed to earn the money. So you don't know, or they don't know how much money to expect back. And that's one thing, mediation. So another way would be arbitration. Now, arbitration is a bit more expensive than mediation, but it's also binding. And one thing I didn't say is, for mediation, you can go in there without an attorney, but my advice is generally, I'm sorry for using the word advice, but I would say hire an attorney if you can. But you can always go into a mediation and an arbitration without an attorney. An arbitration is, however, a binding conference, so anything that is determined at that stage will hold, and to overthrow that decision, it must be appealed. Now, the next thing, and this was stated in the definition of what a contract is, every contract must have consideration. So we are still saying that our agreements are unilateral, because I have in my contract saying that payment must be made prior to performance, and all payment must be made at least a week prior to performance. So the consideration is my promise to perform, but the consideration given by the client is paying, and paying on that schedule that I set. So it's very important that consideration happens. Now, please note that I'm not saying consideration has to be payment, But being in the service industry, it is very beneficial if consideration is set up in the form of payment, whether it be upfront payment with a deposit and continued payment plans, or a full payment. But consideration in the form of payment is something that is a lot better than consideration in the form of a promise to pay. Now, the next thing that we must consider, and happens very frequently and very easily, are how much weight should a prior or future contract have? Now, I'll say, for me, in my contract, I do state that any material changes to a contract must be done in writing. And I also explained that a write-in for my contracts can be as a form of text message or emails. Verbal changes to the contract are not permitted. And I'll say that because we can verbally agree to something, and unless it is written down, just like the basis of forming the original contract, it might turn into he said, she said. So if my client sends me a text message and says, Monique, I am not able to make my payment this Friday. I'll, however, make it next week Friday. And I say, I agree that your payment will be, or payment due date is extended until next Friday. That for me forms an amendment to my contract, because my contract stated that payments were due on a specific date. But with this text message, now I have the ability to say, and my client can use this as a form of reference, that no breach occurred because we had a smaller agreement to pay at a later date. My client made an offer, the date changed, I'll pay you next Friday. I accepted this offer. There was a promise to perform, which is I'm still going to go ahead and do your party, and they are going to pay at that later time. And the rest of the method of consideration and performance will occur per the terms of the original contract. This small amendment that we made did not void my entire contract. It simply added another portion to it. It just slightly modified the payment schedule. And that's one thing that you should keep in mind. How much change to your contract do you allow without voiding the entire contract? That's something that you should always put in your contracts. Now, those are all the topics that I wanted to discuss today. A very broad picture of how to consider things to put into your contract, the legal things that should be in your contract. In a later video, I will give you the actual breakdown of my contract. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to check out that second part to this contract video once it's posted. Have a wonderful day.